Midway, June 1942. JN-25B, Japan's encoding module, was a sophisticated method to encrypt classified messages. It would take years for normal individuals to decipher even a single sentence of this secure transmission. However, in a windowless basement in Pearl Harbor, code-breaking specialists of Station Hypo had managed to decipher them in mere hours. Two letters had stood out to these experts: AF. Unlike the abbreviation that teenagers use while texting, these few letters had much superior importance. The codebreakers had found the secret code name that the Japanese used for Midway. After trapping the Japanese by sending a decoy transmission which baited them to use the term AF to directly refer to Midway, they knew the Japanese were going to launch a surprise attack on the island. These codebreakers were reminded every day of how the Japanese had started the war between them and the US after they had bombed Pearl Harbor on December 1941. The codebreakers were determined to do whatever they could to stop the Japanese. Being 2,000 kilometers from Hawaii, Midway Atoll was out of range from the aircraft stationed there. The Japanese found it an easy target, a foothold they could gain easily before advancing forward to take more territory from the US. Japan wanted to take Midway, then move toward Pearl Harbor, annihilating the US Pacific Fleet and securing the whole region for themselves. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, in charge of U.S. operations, knew that the attacking force of the Japanese would consist of at least 4 carriers. He already had the Enterprise and Hornet at his disposal from his Vice Admiral William Halsey. Managing to get the Yorktown as well, as Nimitz hurried his troops, he took whatever aircraft and equipment he could get. He knew he needed them at Midway before the Japanese launched their full-on attack. Overall, the U.S. force consisted of 3 heavy carriers, the Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, 8 cruisers, 18 destroyers, 19 submarines, and 115 planes. Meanwhile, the Japanese force consisted of 4 heavy carriers, the Akagi, Hiryu, Kaga, and Soryu, 2 light carriers, 2 seaplane carriers, 7 battleships, 15 cruisers, 42 destroyers, 10 submarines, and around 230 planes. Suffice it to say, even with the extra US carriers and ships, the US were still significantly outnumbered. The Japanese were cruising toward Midway from southern Japan, Saipan, and Guam, with their communication devices off, trying not to alert the Americans. General Isoroku Yamamoto of the Japanese had devised an incredibly complicated strategy to take Midway. Under Operation MI, his planning required the timings of multiple naval squadrons to be perfect and exact. The margin of error was titanic. The plan relied on the US only having the carriers Hornet and Enterprise available and American morale being low. At 9 a.m. on June 3rd, a U.S. scout plane spotted a subsidiary Japanese force 930 kilometers to the southwest of Midway. Bombers were dispatched to deal with the situation, and all of them dropped their bombs successfully. However, no bombs actually connected with any targets. At 1 a.m. the next morning, a Japanese oil tanker was hit with an aerially launched torpedo. It was the only torpedo hit of the whole battle on the US side. They were very inaccurate with their torpedoes. At 4:30 a.m., 108 offensive Japanese planes were sent to attack Midway, with 8 scouting planes being assigned to survey a massive area, an operation which they could not undertake. At 5:30 a.m., U.S. scout planes had already found the location of 2 Japanese carriers and the offensive strike force on its course to Midway. Defensive planes from the U.S. were quickly scrambled and bombers were sent off, unassisted, to bomb the Japanese carriers. At 6:20 a.m., the Japanese had successfully bombed the operating base at Midway, and an aerial battle assisted by Midway anti-aircraft guns had taken place, with heavy casualties between both sides. The Japanese attack was unsuccessful in rendering the US base inoperable, as aircraft could still utilize it and its land-based defenses were mostly undamaged. Another attack would be needed to neutralize the island. By this time, the attacking American force, which consisted of bombers, had begun their assault on the Japanese carriers. The Japanese fended off these attacks easily, losing only 2 planes while the US lost 17. A squad of bombers, after dropping their unsuccessful torpedoes, had run into the Akagi while trying to escape. The strategic position that they were in forced the Japanese to hold their fire in order not to damage their own ships. Having no other options, the planes had to dive onto the Akagi, firing their mounted automatic guns at the carrier. However, a plane which was heavily damaged could not pull out of its dive. Its pilot, realizing his dire situation, tried to aim for the ship's deck, aiming to cause an explosion when his plane would collide with the ship. The plane, however, had missed and crashed into the ocean instead. The tactic that this pilot had used was unintentionally one of the first times in the Pacific War when kamikaze-like techniques were used. The Japanese would use the same suicide by explosion tactic later in 1944. This close call angered Akagi's commander, Admiral Nagumo. Yamamoto made it vitally important that all carriers have at least half of their planes in reserve, only utilizing them for defensive purposes, but at 7:20 a.m., Nagumo, angered by both the unsuccessful attack on Midway and on his carrier, began to arm his planes with ground attack bombs, preparing to send another strike force to bomb Midway once again. Suddenly, he received a transmission that a large American force was nearby. Indecisively, he aborted his order and sent scout planes to locate that force. It took half an hour before the planes came back to report the sighting of one carrier. Nagumo did not know what to do. Because of the Japanese indecisiveness, operations were slow and Japanese carriers never got the chance to actually deploy their reserve planes at all. Additionally, after witnessing how the American bombers had been obliterated so easily when they didn't have escort planes, he was very hesitant to send out his own planes. Due to this, the Japanese lacked a vital part of their force and only had a portion of their airworthy planes in the air, not capable of sinking even 2 carriers. While the Japanese were being indecisive, an American strike force was already heading straight toward Nagumo, and he could not do anything as he had decided to wait for his prior squadron of assault planes to return before arming any more planes, which in itself would take half an hour. The American carriers had already launched their planes, while the Japanese still had most of their planes in reserve. But the Americans were not as stoic as they seemed. Each of the 3 carriers had hastily sent out planes in many different groups instead of coordinating one unified attack force. Their commander, Raymond Spruance, had decided to take the risk that continually attacking the Japanese would be better than if they had let them figure out a way to launch a cohesive counterattack. Even though it took considerably longer for the US carriers to mobilize their aircraft compared to the US, they were still able to get 117 aircraft into the air. Due to the hastiness of the whole ordeal, many American planes had gone in the wrong direction. Some had to abandon the plane entirely, with only a few squadrons reaching the Japanese carriers. Due to the different times in which the waves of planes came, some bombers were unassisted and, like before, were effortlessly shot down, with the torpedoes entirely missing the target or hitting the target and not exploding. At 10 a.m., many Japanese planes had run out of fuel, and most of the remaining defensive forces were concentrated on the third incoming wave of American bombers. At the same time, a few squadrons of American aircraft had been desperately searching for the Japanese carriers after heading in the wrong direction. They were low on fuel but decided to continue their search anyway. Luckily, they had found the Japanese fleet. Nimitz said that the actions of these squadrons had, quote, decided the fate of our carrier task force and our forces at Midway. Incredibly, the stars had aligned and the squadrons had arrived at the exact time, altitude, and position to bombard the Japanese carriers, while the defending Japanese forces were in the other direction, anticipating another bombing run, unwitting of the attack behind them. Because the Japanese carriers now realized how important it was to resupply and deploy their planes, they had flammable fuel, torpedoes, and explosives sitting on the deck. This made them extremely prone to explosions and very likely to catch on fire in the case that a 200-kilogram bomb would be dropped on them. Two squadrons went to bomb the Kaga, and a few planes went to deal with the Akagi. The Kaga had no chance of surviving. It had received multiple hits, one of which killed the entirety of its officership and its commander. Amazingly, the three planes which had bombed the Akagi had also succeeded in sinking it. Both ships, once hit with even one bomb, had immediately caught on fire, and it spread throughout the whole carrier. Similarly, another squadron had targeted Soryu and dealt devastating damage to it. The Hiryu was also attacked, but no bombs had connected. General Nagumo, who was on the flame-ridden Akagi, was unable to do anything, having to transfer to the cruiser Nagara at 10:40 a.m. Since no carriers had been hit below the water, they all remained aflame and afloat for some time, but eventually they all had to be scuttled and decommissioned. However, this is not the end of the story. The Japanese have always been known to be fierce fighters, not scared of continuing the fight even when they're clearly going to lose. The unsunken Hiryu, which wasn't hit by any bombs, quickly launched its planes and chased after the American aircraft that were going back to their carrier. They found the Yorktown and delivered 3 blows to its body. This forced their commander, Admiral Fletcher, to transfer to the cruiser Astoria. Repair crews desperately fixed the ship and get it operational again. When the second wave of planes came from the Hiryu, the Yorktown was so well repaired that it seemed to them like a whole other carrier. This time, the Japanese were successful in disabling Yorktown. This caused the surviving Japanese planes to report that they had sunk 2 carriers. This gave the Japanese much more morale. They had thought that the tables were finally turning in their favor. Hiryu frantically launched its only remaining wave of planes to potentially take down what it thought was the last American carrier. However, by this time, an American scout plane had found the Hiryu. The remaining American carriers excitedly launched their own offensive aircraft force, which had dominated the Hiryu and left it, like the other Japanese carriers, ablaze and disabled. It was night at this point. Admiral Fletcher chose to hand command over to Admiral Spruance, who controlled both the Hornet and Enterprise. Now he controlled all 3 American carriers. The burning Hiryu was then recovered by a Japanese escort carrier. However, by that point it was irrecoverable. The ship's captain, who was one of Japan's best carrier commanders, and its officers, realizing that Japan had essentially lost the war at that point, decided to go down with the ship. A younger crew member wanted to go down as well, but was denied. Smartly, Admiral Spruance at that point had decided to withdraw. If he had chased the Japanese in the night time, the remaining Japanese heavy ships would have decimated the Americans, because the Japanese were experts at nighttime naval combat. After this, it was basically the US picking off the remaining survivors and dancing around with the Japanese, getting very close to discovering General Yamamoto's main fleet, but ultimately missing it. There was also a submarine counterattack on the Yorktown, which had sunken it along with another ship. Overall, the Japanese had lost 3,000 men, while the US lost only 300. The US had lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and 150 aircrafts, compared to the Japanese loss of 4 carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 2 destroyers, and 248 aircraft. The decisive victory at Midway was the first big American naval victory over the Japanese. It was a turning point in the Pacific War. After defending the foothold of Midway, the US were then able to continue their operations in the Pacific. They eventually started island hopping in Japan, then finally they dropped 2 atomic bombs on the country, which caused her to surrender. Overall, the Battle of Midway was an extremely important contributor to the result of World War II. It demonstrated the effectiveness of foresight, quick thinking, and determination. It is one of the most important naval battles of the Second World War.